billionaire who thought money could solve everything discovers life's greatest treasure when a waitress shows him how to see the world through his son's eyes. Richard Lawson was a man whose name was known in newspapers, on television, and in the business world. People spoke about him as one of the richest men in the country. He owned companies in technology, real estate, and even hotels across the world. To outsiders, he seemed like someone who had everything a person could ever dream of: money, power, respect, and fame. When he walked into a room, people noticed him. He was tall, confident, and carried himself like someone who was used to being in control. But there was one thing that people did not know about him: his struggle as a father at home. Away from the flashing cameras and boardrooms, Richard was simply a single dad trying to raise his little boy, Ethan. Ethan was 6 years old, a sweet child with big brown eyes and a quiet smile. He was gentle by nature, but had challenges that made life a little different. He did not always talk the way other children did, and sometimes he would find it difficult to play or focus. While other children laughed and shouted loudly, Ethan often stayed to himself, fiddling with his toys or humming quietly. For Richard, who was used to solving million-dollar problems every day, the challenge of understanding his son felt much bigger than any business deal. Richard loved Ethan deeply, but showing that love was hard for him. He had grown up in a strict family where emotions were not openly expressed. His father had been a businessman too, always busy and rarely at home. As a boy, Richard had promised himself that he would do things differently when he had a family. But now, standing in the very position his father once stood in, he realized how easy it was to repeat the same mistakes. Work took most of his time, and when he was with Ethan, he did not always know how to connect. He could buy his son the most expensive toys, the latest gadgets, or even arrange private tutors. But none of it seemed to bridge the gap between them. Sometimes, late at night, Richard would sit in his grand living room and watch Ethan sleep. The boy looked so peaceful, curled up with his stuffed toy, unaware of the worries his father carried in his heart. There is in those quiet moments Richard felt helpless. He could buy skyscrapers and close international deals, but he could not figure out how to bring out the same smile in his son that he saw in other children. Deep inside, he feared that Ethan might grow up feeling unloved or misunderstood, the very way he had felt in his own childhood. One day, Richard decided something had to change. He told himself that if he truly wanted to be a different kind of father, he needed to step out of his world of board meetings and private jets and step into Ethan's world. He realized that his son did not need grand things. He needed presence, attention, and love. With this thought, Richard began taking Ethan to places outside their luxurious home. Instead of playing in the massive garden of their mansion, he would take him to public parks where other children ran and played. Instead of always eating at five-star hotels, he started taking him to small local restaurants, hoping to make everyday memories together. At first, these outings were not easy. Richard often felt out of place. He was used to polished environments where everyone wore suits and spoke about profits and investments. Sitting on a park bench with juice boxes in hand felt strange to him. But when he looked at Ethan trying to climb the slide or watching the ducks in the pond with wide eyes, Richard knew he had made the right choice. These were the moments that mattered, even if he felt clumsy and unsure. Ethan, too, was slowly noticing the difference. He still struggled with social situations and often clung to his father's hand. But he enjoyed seeing the world outside the walls of their mansion. Sometimes he would smile at little things: a balloon seller at the park, a dog running after, a stick, or the sound of music playing from an ice cream truck. Those small smiles gave Richard hope. They told him that maybe, with time and effort, he could find a way to connect with his son, the billionaire who had once been surrounded by people praising his success, was now learning the value of silence and patience. Instead of controlling situations, he was learning to simply watch, listen, and be present. When Ethan pointed at something and laughed, Richard would laugh too, even if he did not fully understand why. When Ethan grew restless and wanted to walk around in circles, Richard followed him, letting his son lead instead of always being the leader himself. These little acts, which seemed ordinary to most parents, were huge steps for Richard. They showed that he was willing to leave behind his pride and enter his son's world with an open heart. Despite these efforts, there were still times when Richard felt unsure. He worried whether he was doing enough, whether Ethan would ever fully respond to his love. He often wished for guidance, someone who could show him how to reach into his son's world more deeply. But he kept reminding himself of the promise he had made long ago, that he would not repeat his father's mistakes. No matter how difficult it felt, he would keep trying. And so, the story of a billionaire father and his quiet little boy continued. It was not a story of wealth or business victories, but of a man learning how to be a father. Every day was a new chance, a new challenge, and a new hope. Richard did not know it yet, but soon an unexpected encounter in the most ordinary of places would change everything for both him and Ethan. It was a Saturday afternoon when Richard decided to take Ethan out again. He had been thinking for days about how to spend more time with his son in ways that felt natural, not forced. He wanted Ethan to experience life beyond the walls of their home, and he wanted to see his son laugh, even if only for a little while. That day, instead of going to a park or a playground, Richard thought of something different. He decided they would go to a small cafe he had once noticed while driving through town. It was nothing like the fancy restaurants he was used to. It had simple wooden chairs, warm lighting, and a smell of freshly baked bread that drifted into the street. Something about it felt inviting, and Richard thought it might be a good place for Ethan to feel comfortable. When they walked in, the cafe was buzzing with quiet chatter. A few families were sitting at tables, children sipping on milkshakes while parents enjoyed coffee. Ethan held tightly onto his father's hand, his eyes scanning the room nervously. Crowds often made him anxious, and Richard felt his little hand trembling, bent down and whispered softly, "It's okay, Ethan. We'll just sit and have something nice to eat. You'll like it here." Ethan didn't respond with words, but he leaned closer to his father, showing that he trusted him. They chose a table near the window where Ethan could look outside if he felt uncomfortable. Richard tried to make things easy for him, pointing to the menu and asking, "Would you like pancakes? Or maybe a milkshake?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He never liked being rushed, so Richard patiently waited. Finally, Ethan pointed at the picture of a chocolate milkshake, and Richard smiled. "Chocolate milkshake it is." As they waited for their order, Richard noticed how restless Ethan was becoming. The boy kept sliding down his chair, tapping his fingers on the table and glancing at the floor. Richard knew these signs. It meant Ethan was struggling to stay calm in the new environment. Just as Richard began to worry about how to handle the situation, a young waitress approached their table. She had kind eyes, a cheerful smile, and a gentle voice that immediately caught Ethan's attention. "Hello there," she said warmly, looking at Ethan before even glancing at Richard. "Are you excited about your milkshake?" Ethan blinked at her, unsure how to respond. He rarely spoke to strangers. But instead of pushing him for an answer, the waitress crouched down so that her eyes were level with his. She didn't treat him like just another customer, she treated him like a child who mattered. "You know," she continued softly, "chocolate milkshakes are my favorite too." For a brief moment, Ethan's lips curved into the smallest smile. Richard, watching from above, was stunned. He had never seen a stranger connect with his son so quickly. Most people either ignored Ethan or grew impatient when he didn't answer right away. But this young woman, without even trying too hard, had managed to make him feel seen. When the milkshake finally arrived, Ethan sipped it happily, but soon he grew restless again. He slid off his chair and sat on the floor, humming to himself. As he traced patterns on the tiles with his finger, normally, this was the moment when waiters or other people would frown, sometimes even asking Richard to control his child. Richard braced himself, worried that the waitress might get upset too. But instead, something completely unexpected happened. The waitress knelt down and, without hesitation, sat on the floor with Ethan. She didn't laugh at him or scold him. She simply joined him in his world. "What are you drawing?" she asked softly, looking at the invisible shapes he traced. Ethan looked at her with surprise. Most adults ignored this part of him. She leaned closer, pretending to see the shapes. "On the floor, that looks like a star. And that one, is it a circle?" Ethan's eyes lit up. For the first time that day, he giggled and nodded. Then he traced another shape, and she guessed again. Each time she guessed, he laughed a little louder, shyness slowly fading. Richard sat frozen in his chair, watching this scene unfold. He had never seen anyone, not even professional therapists, get through to Ethan so naturally. His son was laughing freely, openly, without hesitation. It was as if the waitress had unlocked a door that Richard had been knocking on for years without success. Other customers glanced at the unusual sight. A waitress in uniform, sitting cross-legged on the cafe floor, playing with a little boy. Some smiled, some looked puzzled, but no one interrupted. To Richard, it was as though the whole world had gone quiet and only this moment mattered. He felt his throat tighten, as emotions he wasn't used to handling rushed through him. Pride, relief, amazement, he wasn't sure what to call it, but he knew he was witnessing something special. The waitress continued to play with Ethan, crawling on her hands and knees, pretending to be a cat. Ethan laughed so hard that his small shoulders shook, and soon he joined her, crawling beside her across the floor. The cafe filled with the sound of his laughter, and Richard's heart swelled. Had spent so much money, hired experts, bought expensive toys, and yet here was a simple waitress who had given his son something priceless in just a few minutes' joy. For Richard, this moment was more than just a game on the floor. It was a window into what his son needed: patience, understanding, and someone willing to enter his world instead of forcing him into theirs. He realized that all the things he had been trying to do, fixing, controlling, planning, were not. What Ethan needed, what his son needed, was connection, and this young woman had shown him how simple and beautiful that connection could be. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face, the first time in a long time. Richard saw his son not as a problem to be solved, but as a child who had so much to give. If only someone cared enough to meet him where he was. In that cafe, surrounded by strangers, Richard Lawson, the billionaire who had everything, felt humbled. Because in that ordinary moment, on that ordinary floor, he had found something extraordinary, and as he watched, he knew deep down that this small encounter was going to change everything, not just for Ethan, but for him as a father too. Richard sat at the table in silence, watching Ethan on the floor with the young waitress. For a long time, he did not move. His mind, which was usually sharp and busy with numbers, strategies, and deals, was suddenly blank. About was the sound of his son's laughter. It was a sound he had rarely heard, and every time it came, it touched something deep inside him. It was light, free, and innocent, the kind of sound that made the world seem less heavy. The sight before him felt unreal. The billionaire used to polished offices and boardrooms was now sitting in a simple cafe, watching his son crawl on the floor beside a waitress. To anyone else, it might have looked strange, but to Richard, it felt like witnessing a miracle. For years, he had worried that Ethan might never find a way to connect with the world. He had tried expensive therapies, bought books about parenting, and even flown in experts from different countries. Yet none of them had been able to reach his son in this way. But here was a young woman, a stranger, who had managed to touch Ethan's heart in just a few minutes. Richard leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to understand what he was seeing. His son was not only laughing, but also engaging, pointing, nodding, and even making small sounds to respond to the waitress's playful guesses about his invisible drawings. These were things that rarely happened outside the safety of their home. Richard's chest tightened as he realized how little he truly knew about connecting with his son. For a moment he felt ashamed. He thought about the countless times he had tried to make Ethan happy by buying him expensive toys or gadgets. He remembered the frustration he felt when Ethan ignored those gifts, preferring to sit quietly with his old stuffed bear or hum to himself. Richard had always believed that money could solve any problem. But here was proof that love, patience, presence were more valuable than anything money could buy. As he watched, his thoughts drifted to his own childhood. He remembered sitting in a large house, waiting for his father to come home from work. His father was a man of few words, strict and distant, always busy. Richard used to wait for him with stories to tell, but most nights his father would come home tired and uninterested. "Not now, Richard. I'm busy," was the sentence he remembered most clearly. Slowly, he had stopped trying to share his world. He had grown up believing that emotions were distractions, and that success was the only thing that mattered. Now, watching Ethan, Richard felt a painful realization settle in his heart. He was on the path to repeating the same mistake. If he kept hiding behind his work and wealth, Ethan would grow up feeling the same loneliness he once felt. The thought terrified him. He had promised himself he would be a different kind of father. And yet here he was, unsure of how to bridge the distance. The waitress's simple act had opened his eyes. She had not seen Ethan as a problem or a burden. She had seen him as a child with a world of imagination. She had chosen to join him there, instead of forcing him to behave like everyone else. That was something Richard had never truly done. He had always been trying to pull Ethan into his own structured world, instead of stepping into his son's. Ethan's giggles grew louder as the waitress pretended to be a dog, barking playfully. Other customers smiled, and some even laughed softly. At the sight, Richard, however, felt something else: hope. For the first time, he believed that maybe his son did not need to be fixed the way he had always thought. Maybe Ethan was already perfect in his own way, and all Richard needed to do was learn how to meet him where he was. When the laughter finally settled and the waitress stood up, brushing off her apron, she smiled at Richard. "He's a wonderful boy," she said gently. "He just needs people to see the world the way he sees it." Her words stayed with him. They were simple, yet they carried a truth that struck him harder than any business lesson ever had. As Ethan climbed back into his chair, sipping his milkshake happily, Richard kept his eyes on him. Something inside him shifted. He realized that being a good father was not about giving his son the best schools, the most expensive toys, or the safest home. It was about giving him love, patience, and acceptance. It was about sitting on the floor if that's where Ethan felt comfortable. Even if it meant crawling and laughing like a child again. The turning point came quietly but powerfully. Richard no longer saw his son's differences as weaknesses. He began to see them as a unique way of experiencing the world. And instead of feeling frustrated or helpless, he felt grateful that he had been given a chance to learn from his son. As they left the cafe, Richard held Ethan's hand more firmly than before. The boy looked up at him with chocolate still on. His lip sync gave a small smile. That smile was enough to melt the walls Richard had built around himself for years. He knew then that his life, and Ethan's life, would not be the same anymore. The billionaire who once measured success by numbers and achievements now understood that true success was something else entirely. It was hearing his son laugh, was holding his hand and walking out of a cafe with hope in his heart. It was realizing that love required more than money. It required presence, humility, and the courage to change. That day, Richard Lawson's perspective shifted forever. He had found the key not in wealth or status, but in a simple act of kindness from a stranger who had shown him how to step into his son's world. And with that realization, everything began to change. Richard could not stop thinking about the young waitress after that day in the cafe. The image of her sitting on the floor with Ethan, laughing and playing as though nothing else in the world mattered, stayed in his mind like a picture he could not erase. He replayed it again and again, remembering how Ethan's face had lit up with joy, how he had laughed freely without fear or hesitation. It was something Richard had longed to see for years, and yet it had come from a stranger in a simple uniform, not from him. That thought filled him with both gratitude and sadness. Gratitude, because she had shown him what was possible, and sadness, because he realized how much he still had to learn about being the father Ethan needed. For the next few days, Richard found himself distracted. In his office, where he usually focused on meetings and deals, his mind wandered back to that cafe. He remembered the waitress's gentle voice, the way she spoke to Ethan with patience and kindness. In her words, "He just needs people to see the world the way he sees it." Those words had pierced something deep inside him. He began to wonder if maybe she could help, not just for that day, but for Ethan's future, finally. After much thought, Richard made a decision. He returned to the cafe one afternoon with Ethan. The waitress, whose name he learned was Anna, greeted them with her usual bright smile. Ethan, surprisingly, seemed to recognize her. His face lit up, and he tugged at his father's hand, pointing toward her. Richard noticed the excitement in his son's eyes and felt a warmth in his chest. Ethan rarely reacted to people that way. When Anna came to their table, Richard cleared his throat, feeling strangely nervous. He was used to negotiating billion-dollar contracts, but asking this young woman for help felt far more important than any deal. "I wanted to thank you," he said sincerely. "The way you connected with my son the other day, it meant more to me than I can explain." Anna smiled and glanced at Ethan, who was sipping a milkshake happily. "He's a wonderful boy," she said softly. "He just needs a little understanding, that's all." Richard hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind. "Would you consider spending more time with him? Not here, I mean, at home? Maybe as a part-time caregiver? Or even just a companion? I can see that he trusts you, and I think you could help him in ways I can't." For a moment, Anna looked surprised. She had never expected such an offer, especially from a man who looked as important and wealthy as Richard. But then she saw Ethan looking at her with those wide, trusting eyes, and her heart softened. She nodded slowly. "If it will help him, I'd be glad to." And so, a new chapter began in their lives. Anna started visiting their home a few times a week. From the very first day, Ethan welcomed her presence. He would run to the door when she arrived, something he had never done for anyone else. Together, they played, laughed, and explored new things. She introduced small activities, drawing building blocks, simple games that encouraged Ethan to express himself. Sometimes she would crawl on the floor with him, just as she had in the cafe, and sometimes she would guide him gently to try new things. Richard watched in amazement. He saw his son opening up in ways he had never seen before. Ethan's laughter became more frequent, his curiosity more visible. He even started using more words, little by little, encouraged by Anna's patience. Swell with pride and relief, he began to realize that the connection he had been searching for was not impossible. It was simply a matter of time, love, and willingness to understand. But it wasn't just Ethan who was changing. Richard himself began to change too. Inspired by Anna, he started to step into his son's world more often. Instead of staying on the sidelines, he joined their games. At first it felt strange for him, a man who had built empires, to sit on the floor stacking blocks or pretending to be a lion, but soon he discovered the joy of it. He learned that when he let go of his pride and seriousness, he could laugh with his son in a way that felt natural and pure. One evening, Richard found himself crawling across the carpet with Ethan on his back, both of them giggling. His staff, who were used to seeing their boss in suits and authority, were shocked to see this playful side of him. But Richard didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt free, not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, but simply as a father. Anna continued to guide them both. She taught Richard small but important lessons. "Don't rush him," she would say. When Richard grew impatient, waiting for Ethan to answer, "Give him time. He'll respond when he's ready." Or try to see what he's showing you instead of asking him to do what you expect. These gentle reminders became valuable to Richard, who realized he had spent years trying to shape his son instead of understanding him. Through Anna's influence, the house began to feel less like a mansion and more like a home. The cold silence of its grand rooms was slowly replaced with the sound of laughter, the rustle of toys on the floor, and the warmth of shared moments. Richard noticed that even Ethan's eyes looked brighter now, full of life and trust. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard sat in his study, thinking about the changes in his life. He remembered how hopeless he had felt before, how he had worried that he might never reach his son. Now, things were different. He realized that it wasn't about finding experts with long lists of qualifications. Sometimes the right person came from the most unexpected place. A simple waitress had done more for his family than all the professionals he had hired. Richard also felt grateful to himself for making the choice to step into Ethan's world. It had not been easy to let go of his old ways, but the reward was greater than anything he had ever earned in business. He finally understood what it meant to be present, to give love without conditions, to simply be there. Weeks turned into months, and Ethan grew more confident. He began to explore, to smile at strangers, to try new things with excitement. Richard saw in his son a light he had once feared was hidden forever. And with that light, his own heart healed too. The bond between father and son grew stronger each day. Richard no longer felt like an outsider in Ethan's life. He felt like a true part of it. And all of this had begun because one kind young woman had chosen to crawl on the floor of a cafe and see the world through a child's eyes. That simple act had not only brought joy to Ethan, it had rebuilt a father's hope and opened a path toward love, understanding, and healing. And for Richard, that was worth more than all the wealth he had ever earned. The months passed, and Richard Lawson's life no longer looked like it once did. He was still a billionaire, still respected in the business world, but those things no longer felt like the center of his identity. What mattered to him now was something he had once thought he could never truly have, a real bond with his son. Ethan had changed in ways Richard never imagined possible. The shy, quiet boy who once kept to himself was now brighter, more playful, and full of little surprises. Every day, his laughter had become a regular sound in the house, filling its long, empty hallways with warmth. Richard often found himself stopping in the middle of his day just to watch Ethan play. Sometimes he would sit quietly in the corner of the room, while Ethan built towers with blocks, humming softly as he worked. Sometimes Ethan would look up, smile, and motion for his father to join him. Every time Richard dropped what he was doing and got down on the floor, he didn't care if his expensive suit got wrinkled or if his phone buzzed with messages from his office. What mattered was being there at that exact moment in his son's world. Anna continued to visit regularly, and she became more than just a caregiver. This was like family. Her gentle ways, her patience, and her ability to understand. Ethan made her irreplaceable. She taught Richard things he had never learned in books or meetings: how to listen without rushing, how to laugh at small things, how to slow down and enjoy moments instead of always planning for the future. She had shown him that love was not about perfection, but about presence. It wasn't long before people outside noticed the change too. Business partners, staff, and even distant relatives who visited saw a different side of Richard. He was no longer the cold, distant man they once described. He smiled more. He spoke more softly, and his eyes carried a warmth they had never seen before. Some were surprised, others curious, but Richard didn't care about their opinions. The only opinion that mattered was Ethan's. And Ethan's little hand holding onto his was all the proof he needed that he was on the right path. One evening, after a long day at work, Richard returned home to find Ethan waiting for him at the door. This in itself was extraordinary. In the past, Ethan hardly noticed when Richard left or came home. But now the boy's face lit up with excitement, and he rushed forward, hugging his father tightly around the waist. Richard bent down, scooping him into his arms, his heart swelling with gratitude. This simple hug meant more to him than any award, contract, or business victory ever had. It was the reward of love. Slowly, Richard began to rethink his life beyond his home as well. The memory of that day in the cafe stayed with him, not just as a personal turning point, but as a lesson. He realized that there were many children like Ethan children who needed understanding, patience, and acceptance. And there were many parents like him, two parents, who felt lost, overwhelmed, or unsure of how to connect with their children. He thought about how much one act of kindness from Anna had changed his life. What if he could bring that same kind of change to other families? With this thought, Richard began funding programs for children with special needs. He used his wealth not to build taller skyscrapers, but to build centers where children could feel safe, understood, and supported. He hired teachers, therapists, and caregivers who had the same kind of compassion Anna had shown. He wanted parents to see that their children were not broken, but unique, and that love and patience could unlock joy in ways no money ever could. At the opening of one of these centers, Richard stood with Ethan by his side. Reporters and photographers surrounded him, asking questions about why he had chosen this path. His answer was simple. "My son taught me that success is not about money or power. It's about love, laughter, and connection." Everything changed. For me, the day I realized that Now, I want other families to feel the same hope we found." His words touched many hearts, but for Richard, the real victory was not the applause or headlines. It was Ethan's small hand slipping into his as they walked out of the building together. At home, the bond between father and son grew deeper. Richard was no longer just providing for Ethan. He was living with him, experiencing life through his eyes. He spent weekends at the park, chasing balloons and feeding ducks. They had lazy afternoons building castles from pillows. Sometimes, they sat quietly side by side, not needing words to feel connected. Richard found peace in these moments, realizing that this was the life he had been missing all along. One night, as Richard tucked Ethan into bed, the boy whispered something. That brought tears to his eyes. "Daddy, I'm happy." They were simple words, but to Richard, they were priceless. For years, he had wondered if his son felt joy, if he felt safe, if he felt loved. With those two words, all his fears melted away. He kissed Ethan's forehead, holding him close, whispering back, "I'm happy too, son, more than ever." Looking back, Richard saw how far they had come. He remembered the lonely nights when he sat in silence, unsure if he would ever reach Ethan. He remembered the frustration, the doubts, the fear of failing as a father. And then he remembered the day in the cafe, the day when a simple waitress had knelt on the floor and changed everything. That was the moment that had opened the door to this new life. Richard knew now that wealth could build empires, but it could not build love. Love was built in laughter, in patience, in small acts of kindness. It was built in crawling on the floor with a child, in waiting for them to speak when they were ready, in holding their hand when they were afraid. Love was not something you bought, it was something you gave. For Richard, the billionaire who once thought he had it all, life had shown him that true wealth was measured differently. It was measured in hugs, in giggles, in the sparkle of his son's eyes. It was measured in the bond he had finally built, the one thing his money alone could never buy. And so, everything truly changed. The man who had once been surrounded by glass towers and gold offices now found his greatest treasure in the simple joy of being a father. The little boy who once stayed in the shadows was now shining with light. And the world, through their story, was reminded that sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest miracles.